Darcy was wandering the streets. She was up to her knees in the snow and mentally scolding herself for having left the house in such terrible weather. To make things worse, the piercing wind relentlessly lashed her face, as if taunting her, causing her cheeks to burn like fire. Darcy made the wrong call when she decided to go off the bus a couple of stops early, so that she could get something for dinner on her way home. The gusts of wind were getting stronger by the minute, trying to tear off Darcy's hood and throw another portion of snow down her collar. Winters in Wyoming are often harsh, and that one was no exception. Despite the fact that it had been snowing since morning, Darcy didn't break her tradition and refused to skip her weekly visit to one particular place. It was the city cemetery where her fiancé was buried. He died 6 months earlier in an unfortunate accident at a construction site. Neil Morgan worked in industrial climbing. Unfortunately, his cable broke while he was painting a multi-story building. As one would expect, the construction company chose to blame the victim, claiming that he didn't monitor the technical conditions of his inventory. Darcy knew that wasn't true, because Neil had always taken his job very seriously and couldn't have made such a fatal mistake. Darcy was 3 months pregnant at the time of her fiancé's death, which made the doctors very concerned for her and her baby's well-being. It's hard to even imagine what Darcy had to go through in order to find the strength to accept the fact that she was now left all alone in this world. The situation was further complicated by the fact that the young woman was raised at an orphanage, so she simply had no family to help her out. Darcy knew all too well that she only had herself to count on. Nevertheless, no matter how hard Darcy tried to say goodbye to her past and forget Neil, she simply couldn't do it. The cemetery caretaker was surprised to see that the young woman kept coming back to visit Neil's grave and always spent a long time talking to him. Nonetheless, going to the cemetery that day was a big mistake. Having gotten into a terrible snowstorm, Darcy quickly realized that she was being reckless. Of course, she couldn't have known that she'd get stuck outside in such horrible weather and would have to trudge knee-deep in the snow. There were virtually no people on the street, which made the young woman even more worried. Meanwhile, the blizzard was getting stronger by the minute. Darcy couldn't hold back her tears, which mixed with the wet snow and started flowing down her cheeks in a cold stream. Having found herself in such an unfortunate predicament, the young woman repeatedly scolded herself for having gone out in such weather. She didn't want to go to the store anymore. Moreover, Darcy's lower abdomen was suddenly pierced by a flash of acute pain. She did feel some pain before, but it was never this strong. Darcy understood that something strange was happening to her body, but she stubbornly continued to dismiss the thoughts that she could be having contractions. Despite the fact that she was less than a mile away from her home, Darcy realized that she didn't have enough strength to get there. The pain in her stomach grew stronger and stronger, which robbed her of the remnants of her strength. Darcy still refused to believe that she started having contractions in the middle of the street in a snowstorm. Just hang in there, you can do it. You just need to go home and call an ambulance and everything will be fine, the young woman kept telling herself. Meanwhile, the blizzard got so strong that it simply turned everything around the young woman into one wall of snow and ice chips. God, why did I have to go to the cemetery today? Darcy lamented, trying to distract herself from the terrifying thoughts. She already realized that there was no hiding from it, and the pain she was feeling really did mean that she was going into labor. Having decided to call an ambulance, Darcy reached into her pocket to get her phone. It was only then that she realized that because of her pregnancy brain, she'd forgotten her phone at home that day. The situation was becoming critical, and Darcy understood that she needed to do something right away. Trying to ignore the intensifying pain in her lower abdomen, the young woman knocked on the first door she came across on her way home. Unfortunately, no one dared to open the door in such a terrible blizzard. Darcy looked at the light in the windows and sadly realized that those people were safely in the warmth of their home, while she had to fight the elements, and all because of her own foolishness. Darcy went from house to house trying to get help. If there was no snowstorm, she would have probably had no problem getting someone's attention, but given the weather, many people simply didn't want to open the door so they wouldn't have to deal with someone else's problems. Can anyone help me? Hey, I need help. Darcy pleaded, continuing to cry. At that moment, the young woman approached an apartment building and realized that her only chance was to try and use the intercom. Having come closer, Darcy started buzzing random apartments. The pain in her belly had become so strong that she could barely stand upright. It's hard to say how the young woman managed to remain conscious and continue to make adequate decisions. When Darcy rang the intercom, she didn't even want to be let inside. All she wanted was to ask for the tenants to call an ambulance. Unfortunately, she was well aware that given the snowstorm, it would take the paramedics at least an hour to get to her. At this point, Darcy got lucky, and the tenants of the apartment number 15 answered her call. Pain was so severe that the young woman could no longer calm herself down and simply screamed at the top of her voice. Darcy knew that it was the only way she could draw attention to herself. Upon learning what was going on, the man immediately volunteered to help her. Finally, the young woman whispered and lowered down onto the snow-covered steps, unable to stand on her feet anymore. At that moment, the door opened and a man in his 60s stepped out into the street. He was wearing a jacket with a hood. "Are you all right?" the stranger asked cautiously. Darcy could no longer speak. All she could do in response was make some indistinct sounds, caused by yet another painful contraction. Frankly speaking, the woman didn't care about anything or anyone anymore. The pain was so intense that Darcy wouldn't care if even Santa Claus himself showed up to take her to the hospital in his sleigh. Most of all, Darcy was afraid that the man would get frightened by her condition and leave her out on the street. To Darcy's surprise, the stranger did no such thing and helped her get up from the snowy steps. "Okay, listen carefully. We're going to go inside now. I'm going to help you and I'll call an ambulance. Try not to focus on the pain and listen to what I tell you," the man said in a quiet, confident voice. Darcy looked at the stranger in surprise. That was about the last thing she expected to hear. Meanwhile, the man was acting like a real doctor. He brought Darcy to his apartment and laid her down on the bed. Then he went into the kitchen. What is he up to? Darcy worried, sinking into obvious oblivion. But she didn't have time to develop her train of thought, because the man returned with the bowl of warm water and a pile of clean towels. Then he helped Darcy take off some of her clothes and got down to business, all the while encouraging the woman with kind words. He acted so skillfully that Darcy never for a moment doubted his qualifications. The man talked Darcy through the entire process, helping her concentrate and tell her to listen to her own body. Darcy knew that she simply had no other choice, and therefore she had to trust this man, who behaved as if he'd been delivering babies all his life. The man's efforts paid off, and soon the baby's cry informed everyone in the building that there was one more beautiful child in the world. "You see, everything worked out fine, dear," the man said happily. Then he carefully wrapped the newborn in a soft blanket and showed him to Darcy. Tears welled up in her eyes. Of course, she spent hours imagining how this moment would go, but she always pictured it happening at the hospital and not some stranger's apartment. But since Darcy had no choice, she had to come to terms with the fact that everything went this way and not as she hoped or planned. As it turned out a little later, the owner of the apartment was Donald Price. The man lived alone, but Darcy would have never guessed so, given the way his apartment looked. Everything was in perfect order. Every item had its own place. Holding her newborn in her arms, Darcy dozed off. To the young woman's surprise, things seemed to have worked out better than she could have even hoped when she was out fighting the blizzard. Next to this confident man, Darcy felt that she did everything right. The young woman didn't know exactly how much time she'd slept for, but she woke up to the cry of her newborn son. "I already called for an ambulance, honey, but they won't be able to get here soon because of the weather," the man explained and helped Darcy change the baby. By lunchtime, the blizzard subsided and the road services got to clearing the snow off the roads. The ambulance only managed to reach Donald's house in the evening. When the paramedic saw the woman with the newborn in her hands, his surprise knew no bounds. It had been a long time since he'd seen successful home birth cases in such difficult conditions. When he saw Donald, the paramedic gave him a thumbs up and nodded. Then he helped Darcy and her baby get to the car. "If I knew that Donald Price was delivering your baby, I might not have even come at all," the paramedic said with a smile. "What do you mean?" Darcy asked immediately, looking at Donald in surprise. The paramedic hesitated for a moment, but didn't want to go into it in front of Mr. Price. And only once they were inside the ambulance did he explain. Donald Price is the best obstetrician in the city. Even though he hadn't been practicing medicine for 10 years, he's still got it. He quit working after his beloved wife died. He simply couldn't get over it and started living as a recluse. Only then did the woman realize that she was lucky enough to end up at the apartment of a very talented obstetrician. Since the delivery went well, Darcy didn't need to stay at the hospital for more than a couple of days, after which she was supposed to be discharged to go home. During her stay at the hospital, Donald Price came to visit her a couple of times and brought her food, clothes, and a diaper for the baby. Darcy named her son Billy after her late grandfather, who served on a submarine. "Look how strong he is," Donald said, not even trying to hide his admiration. Darcy smiled and looked gratefully at the man. She tried not to think about everything that happened the day before, because she understood that going into the cemetery in such a snowstorm was a terrible idea that could have led to some very dire consequences. Darcy didn't want to go home. First of all, it was because the young mother's house was in a very bad state. The roof leaked during the heavy rains, which turned the house into a real swamp. Moreover, there were cracks in the house through which the cold air got inside. It pretty much looked like the house of the three little pigs who decided to hide from the evil wolf inside the flimsy structure. Of course, Darcy wanted to renovate her home, but after Neil's death, it became impossible because she simply couldn't handle such an undertaking on her own. Upon learning of the poor condition of the new mother's house, Donald invited Darcy and her baby to live with him. "Don't worry, there's enough room for everyone. After all, I bought this apartment when I expected to have a big family. But everything turned out quite differently," the man added. "Why don't you have any children?" Darcy asked cautiously. "Well, I actually do, or at least I did. Michael disappeared over a year ago. He worked at one of the gold mines in Alaska. And then his truck got into a snowstorm. They never found him," Donald explained in a trembling voice. Darcy immediately felt terrible to have asked such a personal question. "I'm so sorry, I didn't know," the woman murmured. She suddenly felt so sorry for this smart, attentive man who was left completely alone in this world. Darcy's first instinct was to reject Donald's offer. But then she weighed all the pros and cons and realized that the man was right. After all, living in their dilapidated house, little Billy could easily catch a cold or something worse. Darcy didn't want to risk the health of her baby, and Mr. Price seemed to be very sincere in his proposal. "Thanks for the offer. I'd like to take you up on it," the young mother said, feeling embarrassed by her own words. Donald smiled and picked little Billy up. He looked so natural with the baby that Darcy couldn't help but smile. She wasn't used to her new role as a mother yet, and therefore, like so many young mothers, she was afraid of pretty much every sound the baby made. But Donald was very confident and looked like a true professional. It was Mr. Price who taught Darcy how to swaddle the baby, talked about all the intricacies of feeding him, and even helped bathe the boy. Being around Donald made Darcy feel safe. She was afraid to even think about what it would be like to be all alone at that time. The man's face made it obvious that he was very happy to have Darcy and the baby stay with him. It just so happened that he lived alone most of the time and spent his days reminiscing about the past and sorting through the old family photos. Deep down, Mr. Price still hoped that his son Michael was alive. Although, truth be told, the chances of that being true were very slim. The man understood that it would be nearly impossible to find his son in the snowy Alaska. When Darcy recovered a little after the labor, she started helping Donald in the kitchen. The woman was a great cook, which didn't go unnoticed by the owner of the apartment. "You're an amazing cook," Donald kept saying and smiling at the young mother. Darcy didn't really know when exactly she learned to cook. Having been raised at an orphanage, she always showed interest in cooking. Little Billy wasn't a fussy baby and didn't give his mother any trouble. And having such an experienced doctor at home helped Darcy feel safe and confident. The young mother could easily leave the baby home with Donald to run to the store or simply have some time to herself. A month flew by. Darcy grew so used to Donald that she started thinking of him as her father. Of course, not a day went by that she didn't think about Michael and wish for him to be found and get home as soon as possible. Darcy felt that she'd already loved the man, even though she never met him, but simply because he had such a wonderful father. At some point, she set out to find Michael. She wasn't going to the mines of Alaska, of course. Instead, she decided to take on a different approach. The woman knew that social media could work real miracles, and therefore she posted photos of the missing man on all search engines in the country. Having set out on her mission, Darcy was surprised to see how many people went missing in the country every day. Some of them were eventually found, while others remained missing for years. Darcy knew that the police wouldn't be of much help, because she believed that they were more concerned about searching for criminals than for missing people. At first, Donald treated Darcy's ideas with a fair amount of skepticism. He felt that such an unconventional approach could hardly help find his son. But for some reason, Darcy was confident that she would succeed. The young woman devoted all of her free time to the search. She even called the local newspapers and asked the editors to place Michael's photo in the printed publications. Having decided to significantly expand the area of the search, Darcy contacted volunteers and search organizations working with missing people. It was the woman's confidence and determination that eventually helped her find Donald's son. Unlike all the skeptics, Darcy simply didn't allow all the thoughts that she could fail and truly believed that one day she would definitely find Michael. It happened to be in the spring when the snow was already melting and the streams of water were flowing down the city streets. The most surprising thing was that Michael wasn't found by the search parties or the police. What actually worked was the photograph printed in the local newspaper. Michael was recognized by a hunter who picked him up with a head injury on the side of the road a year ago. As it turned out later, Michael didn't die in Alaska but was rescued by a retired ranger. Most likely, the young man was attacked by some muggers who wanted to get their hands on the money the mining company paid Michael. The head injury caused Michael to lose his memory, and thus he'd been living with the man he didn't know for about a year now. Of course, no one was holding the man hostage. He could leave at any moment. But he didn't have any documents and didn't know who he was, so he really had nowhere to go. But when he saw his own photograph in the paper, he understood everything without words. At that moment, an excruciating spasm pierced his head, which was immediately filled with a whirlpool of thoughts and images from his past. Michael remembered everything. A few days later, he was standing at his father's door. Imagine Michael's surprise when he entered the apartment and came face to face with a woman holding a little baby. "Good afternoon, ma'am," the man began cautiously. Michael didn't know at the time that this fragile woman was the one who was responsible for his rescue. The long pause was interrupted by the sound of Donald Price's footsteps on his way out of his room. Unable to contain his emotions, the man started crying and hugging his son tightly. At the sight of this touching scene, Darcy couldn't hold back her tears either. All this time, she sincerely believed that Michael would return home and she was rewarded for her patience. They all went into the kitchen and Michael told them all about the misfortunes that befell him in Alaska. In turn, Donald told his son the story of how he met Darcy and became the godfather of her child. It was probably at that moment that Darcy and Michael felt the first spark of mutual sympathy, which would later turn into the young people's desire to become a couple. Of course, it didn't just happen overnight. We all know that it takes some time to develop a meaningful connection with another person. Although, when you're infatuated with someone, that time seems to simply fly by. The wedding of Michael and Darcy became the starting point of the new and happy life of two people who loved each other deeply and wanted to leave all their troubles in the past. However, it was Donald Price who was the happiest about this union, because not only did he have his son back, but now he also had a daughter-in-law and a grandson.